Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Taylor. Thank you all for some really thoughtful questions. To you, thank you for bringing your students. It's good to see them. I would highlight, as we're in sort of website mode just for a second, I'd refer all of you to acommonsense.org. It's a website that we've set up here that gives you access to primary documents, historic sites, and lots of historical material that's related specifically to Massachusetts. For students who might want to use that for the purpose of writing their own research papers, there is also an essay contest for students. I would hope you guys would consider maybe entering that. There's a $2,500 prize and a $1,000 prize for the student and a $1,000 prize for the school that participates as well. So at this time, I'd ask the panelists to please come to the stage, and I'd like to introduce our moderator. Gerard Robinson served as Florida Commissioner of Education 2011-2012. Prior to that, he was the Secretary of Education in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Previously, he was the president of the Black Alliance for Educational Options, a co-sponsor of this morning's event. BAEO's mission is to actively support parental choice, to empower families, and to increase quality educational options for Black children. Prior to his position at BAEO, Gerard served as a senior research associate for the school choice demonstration project at the University of Arkansas from 2006 to 2007, and as a senior fellow at the Institute for the Transformation of Learning at Marquette University. Thank you very much for being here this morning.
Thank you, Jim, for the very kind introduction. Thank you, Jamie, as well, for extending to me an invitation to be here. It's always great to come to the Pioneer Institute. It's one of the few places in America where there are very robust discussions about education, about public policy, literature, really ideas in general, and I think that's healthy for our nation. I want to personally thank Bob Moses for not only his presentation today, but also for living a life of courage. You know, it's tough to think that someone would actually have automatic weapons shot at them simply for trying to make sure that the preamble that he started this event off with were real. So I want to thank him for taking some of the brutality and the violence and redirecting that into algebraic expressions. And so I want to thank you for your creativity. I want to also personally thank Taylor Branch for taking American history and making it very interesting and very usable. The teachers in our schools across the nation have to use many materials to teach education. Some of those, of course, are approved. And if you ever want to talk about politics, watch textbook adoption politics. Totally different story. But I want to thank him for his work because, again, he's made the idea of history and particularly civil rights safe and sane for conversation. And I think both of them provided a very good foundation for our panel discussion today, where we will talk about civil rights and its importance in K-12 education. As Jim had mentioned, I've had a chance to work in public policy, and I've had a chance to see the subject of civil rights and education on two fronts. One was as a school teacher in New Jersey. Jersey City and Newark were in the 1990s some very precarious times academically. The Jersey City school system was taken over by the state. Newark would follow some years later. And there was a gentleman named Dr. Robert who said, let's bring together students from New Jersey and Newark to St. Peter's College in Jersey City and offer a Saturday program to focus on language arts and mathematics, but also to broaden the curriculum and focus on history and other subjects. So he found a number of adults in the city. I was one of them. I taught logic because I had a degree in philosophy and also taught African American history. I did this for 2 years on Saturdays and during the summer. And we're proud to say that through evaluations, we identified that students who participated in our program had improved in English language arts and mathematics. But there was really no way to figure out if what I was doing was really boring the students to death, talking about African American history and civil rights. But my aha moment came during the summer when we would bring parents with us to different cultural outings. And the parents began to talk to me about the lessons I shared with their students, because their students went home and had conversations. So I went, aha, it's making a difference. Second was as a state administrator. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, we adopted state standards in the mid-1990s with a focus on history. Virginia having been the seat of the Confederacy and also one of the 5 places where Brown v. Board of Education had a case. It was a tough subject. And even today we talk about the Confederacy, we also talk about civil rights, but embedded in our standards of learning are sections about history and civil rights, and that was a big push from the community, both black, white, Jewish, those of different ethnic and religious persuasions, so a big push. Not too long ago I was in Florida, and I had members of the African American community say, make sure you follow the executive order. And there's an executive order passed by a previous governor who said we need to make sure that schools implement African American history and civil rights into the curriculum. At that time, there were at least 8 school districts in Florida out of 67 that had actually implemented them, and so there was a push to make that happen. So it's there in some areas, maybe not as far as we want, but we're taking steps. Some states are further than others. And to have a conversation about where we are today, where we need to go, we have 4 very distinguished people who will speak to this subject. In your brochure, you have information about their background, but I will just say a few quick points about each person. And then at the conclusion of that, I will turn it over to Dorothy, who's sitting, Diane, who's sitting closest to me. And each person will provide a 3-minute introduction, just pretty much what they want to say about him or herself and what they think about the subject of civil rights and education. Once we go all the way to the end, I will open it up with the first question. I have several in place, and then once we're completed, I will turn it over to the audience and we'll have a Q&A. And so we have Robert with us, who is the Executive Director of Citizenship First. He has spent a number of years as a communications director for the Common Core, Common Knowledge Foundation, and we have some mutual friends on that side of the fence. He was also a school teacher in New York City, and I'm sure he's going to share some of those experiences with us. We have, and I'm going to, Peniel? Yep, we've got Peniel with us. He has a history at Tufts University. He is an award-winning author, particularly on the book that he authored called Waiting Until the Midnight Hour, A Narrative History of Black Power in America. And he is going to share his ideas with us as well. We have Diane, who is a journalist from New York City. She is also, like Taylor, a Pulitzer Prize winning author of Carry Me Home, and she won that in 2002. And has also written a notable children's book in 2004, and she will share her work with us as well. And we have Bill, who has written an encyclopedia on gospel music. He's written a number of scores on the role of music, and particularly gospel music, and what it has meant to our nation. So what I'm going to do is start to my right, and each person again will give 3 minutes, and at the conclusion I'll come back and ask the first question.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this incredible event, and I'm happy to be with my friend Taylor, with whom I share an editor on my book, and my friend Peniel and Bob Moses. Thank you for giving us all something to write about. I grew up as a member of the last generation to experience segregation in the Johannesburg of America, which is what my hometown of Birmingham was known as. And I was a girl a little bit younger than the 4 girls Taylor mentioned who were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. At the time, I don't remember hearing about that, even though Kennedy was assassinated only 2 months later, and I vividly remember, as every baby boomer does, you know, exactly where I was and what I was doing when I heard about that news. My ignorance about what was going on in my own backyard sort of explains what, you know, motivated me, the mind-boggling experience of growing up under segregation that motivated me, after spending the first fifth of my life living this history, to spend the rest of my adult life writing about it. It took me 18 years to write Carry Me Home, my history of Birmingham and the civil rights movement leading up to that crisis and through that crisis of 1963. When I was raising my daughters, I was so happy that they weren't going to have to grow up with this distortion, this moral deformation and distortion that I had experienced under segregation. And I remember that my younger daughter came home from nursery school one time singing "We Shall Overcome," and she was so young that she didn't even understand the principle of overcoming. And when I started singing along with her, she thought I was a genius for knowing that song. My daughter, Lucy, who was in kindergarten at the time, was a little bit more sophisticated, and she asked me, "Mom, why do you keep referring to him as King when his last name is Junior?" And but I remember at the time, they were so young, I had really mixed feelings about telling them about this history at the time, because they were learning something. They had black friends and classmates at the time who they had never seen as different. And I remember, being really reluctant to tell them about King, because whatever you said, they were going to ask themselves, why were they treated differently? And so this is kind of the dilemma of the Martin Luther King holiday introducing children to this material at such an early age. I finally acted on, I sort of, soft pedaling everything until Lucy was in second grade and came home from school with the Martin Luther King holiday edition of Scholastic News. And it referred to King's work as how to settle an argument without a fight. And I thought, oh, all those people, like those 4 girls, would be really glad to know that they were murdered in something that was not a fight. And they referred to King to the segregationists as people who disagreed with King. And I remember thinking, he has now become a human resources facilitator, right? And so this was sort of the distortion, a new form of distortion that they were growing up under. And I marched into my daughter's second grade class to try to tell them about segregation. And I'll stop there, but it really introduced me to, because this will probably come out in the discussion later, but it raised a lot of questions for me about how this material should be and can be taught, and whether there should be some rating system. But what ends up happening is when you start with the easy stuff like Rosa Parks and I Have a Dream, then that becomes kind of imprinted on them as what the civil rights movement was all about, and then it's hard to. But the material is difficult anyway. It's very difficult and it's crucial. So I hope we will get into a little bit more about how to teach that.
Good morning. I live in Washington, D.C., and I think one of the downsides to the progress we've made is it's easy for parents to not tell the kids what has happened. They want to give them the good life. They don't know about the sacrifices of the generation before them. And I say this because I think I'm sort of one of those people, because I grew up just after the civil rights movement. When I was a kid, the big thing was Vietnam. And I had a lot of older people, grand aunts and uncles, who would tell me about Cab Calloway and Lena Horne and people like that. And so I always had a love of history, but I had no connection to the civil rights movement. I never experienced the separate, but the water fountains and the different things that other people had gone through. And when I was in college, I went to American University, but I was always on the Howard University campus for some reason. And one day there was something on the bulletin board about joining the 1993 March on Washington. So I went over there and I volunteered with former Congressman Walter Fauntleroy, who was very active in the civil rights movement, and Dr. King. And I just felt, now looking back, I feel very ignorant, because I had no concept at the time of who he was and who his friends were coming in the office all the time, like James Foreman and Joseph Lowry. I know that Reverend Lowry told a lot of great jokes and kept the humor, pretty high, but I had no idea exactly who he was. And I must say that Taylor Branch's book was my Bible during college. I read that book cover to cover, and when I wrote my own book, I used some things from there. I quoted them. Right. But I think history is so important, and I think it's very important to not allow progress to keep us from sharing the fact of what we have accomplished and what we continue to accomplish. And so that the next generation will be more mindful and respectful of the past and the sacrifices others have made.
All right, good morning. I'm very excited to be here today. My name is Peniel Joseph. I'm coming at this history from a different perspective. I was born and raised in New York City. I'm the son of a Haitian trade unionist who came to the United States in 1964. And I'm 41 years old, and I was on my first picket line at 8 years old. So I come to the study of civil rights in a much more combative, hands-on way. I come to the study of civil rights really through black radicalism, through the study of Haitian history, Pan-African history. One thing we should note today is the passing of Amiri Baraka. And Amiri Baraka really provides a context for my brief remarks on how we should be studying the civil rights movement. Amiri Baraka was a poet, political activist, radical, somebody who went from being Everett Leroy Jones to Leroy Jones and the king of the Lower East Side in the early 1960s, to visiting Cuba in 1960, to conversating with Malcolm X, to becoming one of the key black nationalists and Pan-Africanists of the late 60s, early 70s, to becoming a Marxist, trade unionist, and just all-around hellraiser. He's an example of the civil rights, black power, black freedom struggle that a lot of us don't talk about in a concrete way in the United States of America. Stokely Carmichael is another example. I've just written a biography of Stokely, and that's going to come out in March for people who are interested in Stokely Carmichael. But Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture, who Bob Moses knew, and I've interviewed Bob about Stokely, is another example of a civil rights movement that people don't want to talk about. Somebody who confronted white supremacy, who challenged American capitalism, American imperialism, who challenged a country that talked about democracy rhetorically, but did not live up to those ideals. Because I dispute this notion of redeeming America's soul to this extent. You redeem something that at one point was whole. This democracy has always been imperfect. This democracy was founded in racial slavery, so the idea of redemption is a misnomer. It's really about trying to construct an actual small d democracy, and this is what people who are part of the civil rights movement, the black power struggle, the feminist struggle, all these multicultural social movements of the post-war period did. But to really challenge our students, we have to talk to them about white supremacy. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about the politics and practices of white supremacy that built this country. I direct a center called the Study of Race and Democracy at Tufts, and the reason I called it Race and Democracy is because the founding narrative origin of American democracy is the way race has corrupted this idea of small d democracy. If we don't confront that to our students, even if they're 5 and 6 and 7, and our children, and talk to them about white skin privilege, nothing makes sense. The inequality that is proliferating in the age of Obama doesn't make sense. Mass incarceration, which Michelle Alexander has heroically documented, doesn't make sense. Immigration issues no longer makes sense. The issues that connect gays and lesbians and transgendered people and poor people don't make sense. If we talk about white supremacy and racial and class and gendered hierarchies, suddenly all of this makes sense. So I challenge all of us who are educators, and I taught for 2 years in the South and North Philadelphia school systems in the 1990s, and I taught history to high school students who had been connected to the criminal justice system. And it was hard, it was challenging, but it was also inspirational. And every single day, what we talked about was, why was there poverty? Why was there racial segregation, even in the 1990s? I grew up in a New York City that was undergoing race wars in the 1980s. I was a part of those race wars as a 15 and 16 and 17-year-old activist, right? In Howard Beach marching. I marched with Sonny Carson. I marched with Al Sharpton, who was 50, 75 pounds bigger and was a hero to my generation, right? Because we didn't get to see Jesse Jackson up close, but we saw Al Sharpton in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, and in Queens every day. So when we think about how do we discuss this issue of civil rights to our students, we have to talk about white supremacy, even if it makes us feel uncomfortable. Because yes, there were multicultural, multi-generational alliances, but they were alliances to try to challenge and repudiate the system of white supremacy that has locked us in. It's an interlocking system. It connects race, class, gender, sexuality, but it also connects identity, the way in which we identify. So if we don't confront this idea of white supremacy, if we don't show them that Martin Luther King Jr. was a revolutionary, no less revolutionary than Malcolm X. King tried to bend the American people's will to a kind of vision that people actually did not want. He was not popular the last 3 years of his life, and it's not just Taylor's work, but all this substantive work on the civil rights era shows that, right? He's ridiculed for being against the Vietnam War, but we also have to remind each other that Stokely Carmichael came out against the Vietnam War. SNCC came out against the Vietnam War. They were talking about imperialism and capitalism and feminism in the 1960s. These are all issues that we still confront. So I'll close by saying, what we need to do as educators is tell the truth and speak truth to power. The whole idea that Rosa sat so Martin could walk, so that Barack could fly, that's a nice homily, but it's poor history. This was a rough and tumble struggle where people were murdered and are still being murdered. People were incarcerated and are still being incarcerated. We live in the belly of the beast. We live in the American gulag. So instead of patting each other on the back that we have a black man as president, we have to confront the corruption of the very ideal of King's dream in the 21st century before we can get to the bottom of where we're at today. Thank you.
Good morning. What an inspiring event. It's a thrill to hear Bob Moses and Taylor Branch and this terrific panel. Let me depress you now. Earlier this year, I authored a paper for the Pioneer Institute, along with Sandra Stotsky and Gilbert Sewell. It was titled "Shortchanging the Future, the Crisis of Civics and History in American Schools." And in that paper, we pointed out the following depressing statistics or ideas. The amount of time that is devoted to history in K-12 education has measurably shrunk over time. Because of the increased emphasis on language arts and mathematics and other demands on teacher time, the fundamental building blocks that prepare students for a rich engagement with historical content and civics is largely absent from K-12 education. Problems with teacher training and qualification, certification compound the problem, which leaves teachers poorly equipped to arrest our national decline in history and civics. And past efforts to arrest the decline, however well-intentioned, have had really no demonstrable, measurable impact whatsoever. So in short, it is fair to say that the study of history is on the wrong side of history. Broad societal trends are also working against us. We are less concerned with public affairs than we used to. We pay less attention to the news. Few Americans have the time, the interest, the ability to read complex texts and engage with them over long periods of time, which is a fundamental building block of the study of history. And broadly speaking, we tend to view education, as someone noted earlier today, through a personal economic lens. We want our schools to make our children college and career ready. I'm sure you've heard that. And to make our nation economically competitive, rather than make us civically and historically minded, fully engaged citizens, which was as historians will note, the founding principle of public education. So we've grown accustomed to believing that a state of crisis, this is the good news, I suppose, exists in our schools, because of the failure to push our children to proficiency in reading and math and science. Take a look at the NAEP data sometime, as we did for this paper. This is familiar statistics. If you look at 8th grade NAEP scores, roughly 1/3 of American 8th graders are proficient or better in reading, math, and science. If you look at history and civics, it's 1 in 5. So if we're very used to calling the education state of affairs with reading and math a crisis. Well, if one out of 3 is a crisis, what's 1 out of 5? It's a catastrophe. Fortunately, we know what to do about this. We have now canceled the NAEP tests in civics and history, so we will not be troubled by this data anymore. And this is the response. Look, simply put, our educational priorities are elsewhere. I want to say something that I was not planning to say in reaction to something that was said earlier by the gentleman, and he's no longer here, who was teaching and noting with good reason that he did not want to see. There you go. Very eloquently said he did not want to see Bob Moses reduced to the answer to a multiple choice test question. Well said, sir. But since we are all historically minded, let us remind ourselves of the history that led us to that, to complaining about multiple choice tests. And I will defend tests to a limited degree and only a limited degree. But if you know your history, you'll remember why we have these tests. Because the state of education, these very statistics and data points that I'm pointing out, led us to this sense of crisis where we felt the need to do something. The schools that served our most disadvantaged students were frankly dreadful. Testing did not destroy education. It was an effort to right a profound historical wrong. So now, of course, it has led to a whole new set of problems. But let's not sentimentalize this golden age of education that never was. So again, I will defend testing to a degree. It has had a deleterious effect on teaching and learning, but let's not sentimentalize that the teaching of history. It was bad. It has only gotten worse. And at that point, on that cheery note, I will conclude.
No, that was definitely a cheery note. As you see, we have a very shy panel. And so we're going to have to really draw everyone out. You know, what's interesting is Diane, Bill, and Purnell used childhood memory or children as a starting point as to how civil rights became a reality for them. Bob started us off with the preamble, and of course we talk about posterity. I brought my 5-year-old daughter, Sienna Robinson, with me to participate and listen and meet people. Because when I was 5 years old and until I was 15, in fact 20, my parents did not take me to one civil rights event. Just wasn't a part of our history. It was not, and Bill and Purnell referenced this either as Howard or Stokely Carmichael. It wasn't until I was a student at Howard University that I found myself baptized into the history of the civil rights movement, only to graduate 4 years later to understand that as just a later articulation of really a human rights movement that's gone on for very many years and centuries for purposes of self-identification and time. Since Robert started us off thinking very cheerfully about standards, I want to repeat at least something he mentioned and then open it up to him, and then anyone on the panel can feel free to go in. You know, as you mentioned, in 2009, the Massachusetts Board of Education eliminated history from the graduation requirement in this Commonwealth. In 2011, Congress and the White House defunded We the People Project. And I know how important that is to students in Virginia, particularly those at Maggie Walker High School. NAEP, of course, has identified that we will cancel history and civics. So here's my question. Do you think America's students have a pretty decent knowledge of understanding American history? And in particular, do you think that there is a good understanding of civil rights in comparison to how we teach other areas, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's the founding documents, whether it's the Civil War or World War II? What do you think of it, Bob?
The short answer is no. The longer answer is it's complicated. I would say that the civil rights, and look, I come at this from the perspective of somebody who's spent his teaching career in the South Bronx and now Harlem. where we spend more time and attention on the civil rights era. To say that the civil rights era gets more attention than other historical periods is a fact, but it is the very definition of damning with faint praise, as it were.
Anyone else on the panel?
Yeah, very briefly, I think that part of the problem, I know Philadelphia instituted in their high school curriculum where every student in the public schools has to take an African American history class, and that was people like Greg Carr, who's at Howard University, who wrote up that curriculum. But most public school districts don't have that. Most public school, and the textbook they use is Darlene Clark Hines' The African American Odyssey. They use that, and so every public school, high school student in Philadelphia has to take that unit of African American history, and that started around 2001. But that's one of the only big city public schools that does that. So part of this is not just how do you incorporate civil rights into the existing curriculum, but how do you have African American history? And we've been talking about this since the 1960s. Carter Woodson was talking about this in the 1920s, and so it goes way, way back. But how do you implement that into the curriculum? It can't just be a discrete unit. It's got to be something more.
I have a question for you, Peniel. What shocks you? Because when college students at Tufts come and take your classes, they obviously are interested in the topic. But what has shocked you most, say, or what their level of their lack of knowledge? What has surprised you most about what just is beyond their? Yeah.
You know, I've taught Taylor Branch's Parting the Waters. I've taught Hands on the Freedom Plow about women in SNCC and their stories. I think what's probably most surprising is just that the general arc of the heroic period of the civil rights movement from 54 to 65, and the stuff that you cover in Carry Me Home, and that Branch and Clay Carson and other historians of the movement have covered, is not really there. You know, like, so there's not a sense of a framing of sort of the Brown decision, you know, Emmett Till, Rosa Parks, 57 and Little Rock, the February 1st movement, the sit-in movement. Certainly they don't know names like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, but just the scope of it. But they have heard of Martin Luther King Jr., which is sort of the indictment, you know, so it's a point of entree. The 2 points of entree are King and Barack Obama, okay, for high school, students just coming out of high school, because the students I teach are 18 to 22, the graduate students older, but the undergrads 18 to 22 generally, and so they know who Barack Obama is, which is great, it's a good deal, and they know who Martin Luther King Jr. is, so that's a point of entree, but then the other things they're not really aware of, and they know that Malcolm X was this angry black man. You know, they're like, he's the guy, he's really upset, you know? And they think about, you know, the Black Panthers were just gonna kill the whole white race. You know, like the Panthers had guns and were just gonna, you know, they basically were terrorists in the 60s. So that's been the most surprising.
So I'll jump in, and this would be a good time to put in a plug for myself. So one of the things that appalled me, the appalling history that my daughters were getting, sort of prompted me to write this children's history of the movement, which was it's real history. And it's sort of the greatest hits of the movement from 54, the Brown decision, to the, and the lowest marks, you know, of the movement, to the King assassination in 68. And I know that I just wanted it to be, it's real history, it's not sanitized. And I know that, and it's pitched to middle school, but I know that it's been used as sort of Cliff Notes in college if you're taking a course and you just need to get the overview. But anyway, that was difficult to write for reasons because this history, as I said, is so sensitive. Partly is that you have to, for teachers, I sympathize with you because you really have to know this material to be able to confidently talk about it. For example, even to say something, to tell kids that the black middle class, for example, did not support the movement, you really have to know that to be able to say that, because it's offensive to some people, because there's this sense that everybody just got up and followed Martin Luther King to the promised land after he made that speech. And it's just not the case. But you really have to be confident in the material to be able to teach it truthfully.
As you mentioned that speech last year was voted the best speech of the 20th century, I Have a Dream speech. Dr. King concluded with a line from the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we're free at last. We found through freedom rides and other protest movements the incorporation of Negro spirituals, whether it was we shall not be moved, ain't gonna let no one turn us around. So there was a very strong link between civil rights and music. And so, Bill, what do you think the link is and the importance between the role that music and entertainment, or really music, played in the civil rights movement?
Well, I think if you look at even currently, in the last 20 years, whenever there's a movement, whether it's a movement for farmers like Farm Aid, there's a concert with Willie Nelson and John Mellencamp, or Greenpeace, music seems to be the tantalizing thing to draw people. You want to draw a crowd. And back in the day, apparently, I know that Martin Luther King Jr. used to use the Staple Singers. I have this book here, comes out next week. Mavis Staples and Greg Cott from the Chicago Tribune wrote a story about their contribution, or the Staple Singers' contribution to civil rights movement. And during that period, Dr. King and other organizers would, depending on what city they were going to, would ask people to come out. Like in Little Rock, it would be Gladys McFadden and the Loving Sisters, or maybe in Birmingham, maybe Dorothy Love Coates, or some of her, So music has always been a part because of that message of liberation that's in church music, gospel music, the spirituals, the music that carries over from the slavery period. That same idea in the Bible of David and Goliath fighting, Pharaoh and Egypt, those same messages have been applied to the freedom songs and the songs of the civil rights movement. Therefore, that is the connection that made people come out. And if you're out on the front lines all day, protesting, doing sit-ins, the music helps the day go by. I've read this in books that, and actually one time, I used to be a journalist, and I interviewed Odetta one time. And Odetta said that music made the day go by. She was out there on the front line. She wore an afro when it was not popular for black women to wear afros. She was doing all sorts of things that now seem normal, but back in the 50s when she was doing them, they were very unique, and she was thought to be a little different. She sings with a guitar. Not many women sang with a guitar, but that the message is the same, that whether it was in the biblical period or the slave period, the same message of liberation is that message that has permeated most freedom movements.
Any others?
Oh, no, I was going to say, in terms of, we all know in terms of James Brown, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, Marvin Gaye, certainly musicians were really radicalized. Going back to the 50s, Abbey Lincoln with the Natural, and Max Roach and the Freedom Now Suite, and really Paul Robeson, who could bring 15,000 people to hear him speak and to hear him sing at a concert. So, before Bruce Springsteen, there was Paul Robeson, who was even more radical than Springsteen. Yeah.
Harry Belafonte comes to mind as well as someone who was a musician who decided to put activism first. And to make it a contemporary analogy, there's a conversation, some would say, between Jay-Z and between Harry Belafonte in terms of what role should the rap and the hip-hop generation play in the civil rights movement. So this is a continuing dialogue. In the civil rights narrative, there are often men and women who we know very little about. Bob Moses, many of you in the room know about him. If he were to walk somewhere in Boston or other places, very few people would know him, but they would probably know the starting center for the Celtics. Same we could say for a number of civil rights leaders, Fred Shuttlesworth and others. But particularly when we talk about women, there is even a particular silence about the role they have played. We know a few things about Coretta Scott King, a few things about Rosa Parks. Very few, in fact, you mentioned Ella Baker, very few conversations about Joanne Robinson, very few conversations about Septima Clark. And so, Diane, I'd be interested in knowing for you, what role not only did those women play, but is there a broader role in conversation for the role of women and also other men and women in the movement who we know very little about?
I have to plead a little guilty to not giving the women enough credit in my book, because I had to cut it by 2/3. And the Birmingham movement, which was led by Fred Shuttlesworth, whom you mentioned, was the work was done mostly by women, and they did all the organizing. The women were the 2/3 of the membership of the movement were women, and a lot of them were domestic workers. And I remember I met a man who was in the movement whose former wife had been one of the leaders, the female leaders, and he said the women were a lot braver than we were, basically. So I think that though generally, what I've heard from educators and parents, black parents and educators, is that their kids are just tired of hearing about King. And they almost shut down when they hear it again. So I would propose that these so-called minor, lesser known, I mean, frankly, when we talk about the unsung heroes, really the only sung hero is King and possibly Malcolm X. So it's everybody else. And even to be called an unsung hero means that you're in the pantheon. Yeah. So I think that for educators, it'd be really valuable to take, there's so many incredible characters and heroes that this would be just a really interesting way into this material for you. And there's a lot of, and there's so much written about this topic. There's no dearth of writing about all these people who deserve to be, but but in the popular imagination, there's only been room for King and Rosa Parks, it seems. So I would just urge you to look at the women. Ella Baker, it was incredibly interesting because her history was back in the sort of the old left 30s. You can bridge a lot of history there. This material is, to me, it's like a pomegranate, where you think that you open it up, some seeds pop out, and wherever you open, just more things just pop out. It's just the best. It's the best subject ever. And whenever I read a new book about the topic, I look at it, I go, oh no, who's going to say more about so and so? And that's what everybody said about me when I wrote a book about Birmingham. After Taylor's book, what else was there left to say? Well, there was a whole city to write about. There's always more, and your children will find this too.
Yeah, I think women, in terms of the scholarship has caught up more than the general public. So there's great biographies of Jean Theo Harris on Rosa Parks, Barbara Ransby on Ella Baker, Chana Kylie on Fannie Lou Hamer, different anthologies about black women during the civil rights period, Peter Levy on Gloria Richardson and the Cambridge movement. So the scholarship has really, in a way, caught up much more than where it was, say, 30 years ago. And books by Charles Payne and John Dittmer, when they're looking at local people in Mississippi, have been really important on this. But in terms of the general public, I agree that the general public doesn't really think about the black women and white women who are part of the movement. That's changing a little bit. Coming to Broadway is a play called All the Way with Bryan Cranston of Breaking Bad fame, and that was at Cambridge, the ART, in the fall, and it's coming to Broadway in February and March. And that's about 1964 and sort of LBJ just assuming the presidency. And some of the characters in there, besides King, are Bob Moses is one of the characters, Stokely Carmichael, and Fannie Lou Hamer is very, very prominent. So that play is quite extraordinary, and it's actually, on top of it, it's actually very good. It's actually, it's entertaining, but it's also very good as history. So that's a play that people should see, and that could be used as an educational tool as well, because it's not just about LBJ and King. It actually provides a much more panoramic view. Although I think Bob Moses as a character there is perhaps sort of an angrier Bob Moses than the real Bob Moses. But it's a wonderful play, and Fannie Lou Hamer is very, very important, because I think for all educators here, you can use Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony before the credentials committee. That would be a great thing to show to your students, because that testimony, even though LBJ sort of interrupts the live feed, her testimony and is this America, but also saying how they were beaten, women and children are being beaten just because they want to live as decent human beings. You could connect that to a lesson on citizenship, democracy, freedom, what does it mean? And also connect it to the fact that she's a sharecropper who SNCC comes in, and SNCC is all about letting the people decide and organize themselves, even while providing tools for people to better themselves. So she, is 42 years old, Ruleville, Mississippi, and becomes really one of the best organizers and really a hero to somebody like Stokely Carmichael. So you can use Fannie Lou Hamer to track the tentacles of the movement in really surprising ways. Like how is this sharecropper, this black woman who's beaten and brutalized. She dies prematurely in 1977, largely because of a lack of health care and because of physical assaults on her very being. But how has this woman become one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century and impacting these militants and impacting somebody like Stokely Carmichael, who thinks of Fannie Lou Hamer as a hero, and Malcolm X, who calls her one of the greatest freedom fighters. And what does it mean that Fannie Lou Hamer goes to Guinea and is, talking to Sekou Touré and gets that opportunity? These are extraordinary things from somebody who's not usually talked about as an A-line leader.
It's actually a good segue into the next question. U.S. history is often taught through the lens, some would say, of mythology, that we try to sanitize some of the bloods and the guts and the glory of our history in ways that previous generations had not. When we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, Pernell, this is for you. When we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, is it too sanitized, part one? And part two, is it partly sanitized so as we don't have to talk about the Black Power movement? Or if we bring in the Black Power movement, we say Black Power movement, ugly, horrible, bad, civil rights, good, saintly, let's do this.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I'd say that one of the things educators can do here is that, one, yes, the civil rights movement is sanitized, and it's too sanitized, but there's a real reason, because I think those of us who are old enough in this room remember the struggle to get Martin Luther King Jr.'s holiday. My mom was part of that struggle. I remember being in New York City, and just as a young boy who was really surrounded by activists. I had a very, very fortunate childhood to be surrounded by people who were interested in social justice. Many of them are trade unionists, and that's why I'm a big backer of unions. But they were people who were intimately aware of Martin Luther King Jr.'s power, and they were pushing at the local level and pushing at the national level for that holiday. And President Ronald Reagan did not want to sign that into law. He thought King was a communist. He signs that under pressure because there was enough support for that law that it would have overridden a veto, right? So when we think about the MLK law and people like Belafonte and Jesse Jackson, Stevie Wonder, but at the grassroots level, I knew people who were part of that. So that law, that holiday, signed in maybe 1985. And when we think about what does that mean less than 20 years after King's death, that was to make the nation remember and never forget MLK. In 1985, Time magazine wasn't calling MLK one of our founding fathers. In 2013, they were calling MLK one of our founding fathers. So it's important to remember there was a point where there was not going to be an MLK holiday or memorial. People had to fight for that, including people in this room. So that was a heroic struggle that people won. But the price of that victory has been steep. It's been very high. Because what the price of that victory has been is that the country said, okay, we'll embrace King in death, but only to a certain point. And that's been the quid pro quo. He's dead by 63 in the rhetoric. He's dead. March on Washington, August 28, 1963. It's over. They don't want to hear it. They don't even want the Nobel Prize. It's just the March on Washington. That's it. And by 65, 66, 67, 68, no one wants to talk about Chicago or the Poor People's Campaign or King saying that the greatness of America lies in the right to protest for right. They don't want to talk about him speaking to trade unionists, 1199, March 18th, 1968. None of that. Nobody wants to talk about any of that stuff. They don't want to talk about what Taylor talks about in At Canaan's Edge, Michael Honey in Jericho Road, all these books that really document what was going on, especially the last 3 years. At the end of Taylor's first book, he says that King turned into a pillar of fire. And really, the last 5 years of King's life, anti-Vietnam War, war on poverty, Poor People's Campaign, he is a man consumed by a passionate need to transform both the United States, but the world, and he breaks old alliances. There's no more visits to the Johnson White House. He's out. New York Times, Time Magazine, Life Magazine is doing everything but calling him nigger. That's what they're saying. And they're saying, why are you talking about foreign policy? Even though he has a PhD and a Nobel Peace Prize. People like Stokely Carmichael have to defend him at the United Nations, April 15th, 1967, right? So when we think about who King is, we won the holiday and we got the dreamer, but we lost the revolutionary. So that's very important. And very quickly, Black Power becomes a Pandora's box, because even though we've used Black Power as a scapegoat and said it's the evil twin that wrecked the civil rights movement, empirically, that's not true. And I break with people who say that because I'm one of the historians of that movement. I've interviewed hundreds of people about that movement and gone to hundreds of archives globally to sort this out through a series of different books and articles, and Stokely is just the latest one. And what's interesting about that movement, even though there's flaws, there's shortcomings, there's setbacks, what you have are feminists in that movement. You've got radical welfare rights and tenants' rights activists in that movement. You have clergymen, and not just the Reverend Albert Clegg and the Shrine of the Black Madonna, people in New York, in Mississippi, in North Carolina. Bill Chafe talks about civilities and civil rights, Black Power at the local level in North Carolina, and what it meant in 1968, 69, 70. And there's a global movement for Black Power as well. So what that movement does is confront the contradictions of American democracy, right? And that makes people uncomfortable.
You mentioned the death of Amiri Baraka, and I'm reminded that he was one of 3 African Americans to go to Africa for an international conference. Dr. Howard Fuller, who I worked for, was actually one of the 2 people, one of the 3 that had gone. So I'm glad you had mentioned that. This question's for Bill. When my daughter and I walked in, she pointed at the screen and she said, well, who are all those people? And there's a screen here. And at that time, the person who was up there was Andrew Young, former U.S. ambassador, former mayor of Atlanta. He's a reverend. Of course, we know Dr. King is a reverend. There were many others, Shuttlesworth, all reverends. Malcolm X's name has been mentioned, his teacher Elijah Muhammad, Muslim. Religion played a very important role in the civil rights movement. Why in particular? What do you think? And this is also for anyone else who wants to follow up.
Well, I think it goes back to the fact that in the 1800s, the only position the average Black man could get was to be a pastor. So the pastor became a very important and respected person in the community, and those were the leaders of the community. You know, a lot of people forget that Martin Luther King's father was a pastor and a leader, and most of the pastors, even Malcolm X's father was a pastor. There's this whole line of pastors and the leadership that the church gave during those dark days. That was the beacon. And then when the civil rights movement took place, they would meet in churches. That was the safe place where they could go and meet, organize, and rally. And again, that goes back to the whole idea of the music and the spirituals being rooted in the church world. And I think that, wait a minute, what was the question again? Oh, okay, all right. Anyway, it's, religion has always played a part because that is the foundation, I believe, the foundation for the civil rights movement was the church, and out of that has risen everything else.
I'll just say one of the nuances of this history, though, is that the modern civil rights movement was based in the church, was created by organizers who'd come out of an old labor left tradition, the aforementioned Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, and a white communist active lefty, Stan Levinson, who was one of Martin Luther King's advisors. And they sort of deliberately designed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to be led by ministers based in the church so that it could not be red baited, because they knew it would be. So this might be over the heads of middle school people, but it's probably not over the heads of high school people. So it's just one of these interesting things where it sort of desentimentalizes it, where it takes it out of the church and sort of, which was key for many reasons, but it's everything's more interesting than it seems on the surface.
So we're in Boston, a city for a lot of firsts as it relates to protests. We know that it was here that much of the ideology to break us free from English domination, some of that took place here in Boston. We also know a big push. 1849, there was a case where a young black girl and her dad were simply trying to go to a school that they wanted to go to, and while the court argued not in favor of her family, in 1855, Massachusetts, one of the earlier states to actually pass a state law dealing with education and the issues of race and trying to keep schools integrated. You move to the 50s, and we're talking about the civil rights movement. Some will say that the North will often say, well, a lot of the problems of racism and legal segregation, well, those were Southern problems. Those really weren't Northern problems. And yet we can remember in the 1970s some of the challenges with desegregating schools here in Boston. We know the book, the Pulitzer Prize winning book, Common Ground, where Anthony Lucas addressed some of those concerns. Robert is someone who taught school in the North, who has seen this also from the area of research and writing. Do you think that claim holds any water?
Sorry, which specific claim?
The claim that the Northerners think that this is really a Southern issue that's really not a Northern issue.
I will answer that question, but it may, I'm going to discourse a little bit. Sure. We were saying before that the civil rights era is sanitized, and as that conversation was happening, I wrote a note to myself which says simply, history is sanitized. This is a practitioner problem, and frankly, I don't know how to solve it. So if anybody has some great ideas, I would love to hear them. It is all well and good and terrific to listen to my historian colleagues on the panel talk about this deep, rich, wonderful history, which is thrilling. I know some of it myself. I'm learning some of it myself. All of it I learned long after I left school. Here's what those of us who work in schools do all day. We look at standards. We look at curricula. None of this stuff is going to show up. And if it does, that means something else has to leave, right? So in a way, I want to answer the question with a question, which is, if you guys do what I do and what people who influence what I do sit around and do all day, if you're going to write history standards, if you're going to write history curricula, What specifically would you say American school children should know about this period? Now let me give you a little bit of the standards lingo. There are process standards and there are content standards. Content standards means these are the facts that you should know about this period. Process standards are this is what you should be able to do with those facts. The answer to that question answers your question, Jordan. So I want to throw this back to my fellow panelists. What do you want the graduate of an American school to be able to know and do with the information from this era?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. One, in terms of the answer to the question that was asked, I think the North does get off scot-free in the way in which we teach it. But in terms of the scholarship, that's really not.
Should that be in the standards?
Not true. Yeah, no, I actually think it should be in the standards, but I think that part of the problem with what we've done with standards, and I taught high school for 2 years, but it was at a charter school, so we had more leeway, is we're trying to compress this very, very important history into what you've talked about with just a set of facts and what do we want people to get out of this. I think we want our high school students to come out of graduating high school, one, as critical thinkers, with all these tools to understand a complex landscape. So one, I would hope that they understood that when we think about civil rights, it was not just, even though they might be regional variations, it was a national problem. It was a national struggle. Taylor alluded to the speech that JFK makes on June 11, 63, where he says as much too, because we remember the whole notion where he says it's a moral problem, but it's a very specific and it's a very powerful speech where he's talking about rates of death for Negro children. He's talking about the income that blacks make, that is going to be much lower than whites. But he also says that it's not just a regional problem, because he's speaking at a time period where people are trying to claim it's just happening in the South. And the summer of 63, and Taylor writes about this really, really very, very well, where there's 15,000 arrests, hundreds of demonstrations all throughout the United States, north, south, east, and west. So we're really seeing a national crisis in the 1960s. It's not just Mississippi. It's not just Alabama. It is Boston. It is New York City, where I'm from. It is parts of Oakland and Los Angeles, Chicago. It's everywhere. So we want our students to come out of it knowing that, race relations in the 1960s and civil rights is a national problem. Even though the South may have specific artifacts of Jim Crow, like colored and white signs, that Boston did not have, there are huge marks of segregation and Jim Crow everywhere. There are neighborhoods you literally cannot walk through in Boston in 1964 and 65, or 74 and 75. If you are a black man or a woman, you will be brutalized, you may be killed. That is Jim Crow segregation. Even if there's no signs that say, hey, black people, don't come here, it's factually correct. So what we'd want them to get is the fact that this is a national problem. Because if we get that it's a national problem, we don't play favorites. We don't say that, civil rights was bad for people in the South, but we were fine in our own backyard. When that wasn't the case, it's just that the way in which Jim Crow was manifested in our backyard right here in Boston was a little different, but the outcome was the same.
I just wanted to add that
That's a great question.
where I grew up in Washington, D.C., we had a unique situation. We had Washington used to be known as the Chocolate City because we had a black city council, we had a black mayor. All of the departments were run by black people. And then over in Maryland, you had Prince George's County, which is the largest concentration of black wealth in the whole United States. I started off in the PG County school system. I ended in the Washington school system. Never did I hear anything about civil rights, black history. I mean, in February, there would be a board and they'd put some pictures up there, but no one talked about it. It wasn't part of the class. And not until I got to college at American University, when we had a visiting professor, Jacqueline Rouse, I believe, from Spelman, came in for a year, and I was the only black person in the class, and she took me aside and gave me a little pep talk and said, "You need to do better. You need to know this stuff." And she gave me this book by Anne Rice. No, not Anne Rice. No, Anne Moody, the autobiography of Anne Moody. Right. I knew it wasn't Anne.
It's giving you bestsellers.
But that started me on the road to really studying this, and it wasn't too long after that I read Taylor's book, and I started reading Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, and the autobiography of Malcolm X, which I think is still my favorite book, because he just did everything. He was just all over the place. He was up here in Boston, he was in New York, he was in Chicago, and he lived, in a short time, he lived a really great life. I mean, great in the sense that he lived life. He didn't take no for an answer. He lived his life, and I think kids should know about him. I think it's terrible that he gets this rap as being the demon, and Martin Luther King is the hero. I mean, I think they were both heroes, and they both responded to the world they were living in based on their different experiences. You know, Martin Luther King came from privilege, Malcolm X came from poverty, so naturally they're going to react differently. But I think when it comes to schools, the schools I went to taught nothing. Most of my teachers were black, and I still didn't get this information. So something is better than nothing.
I think there are a lot of conversations going on here, but I think this is kind of the essence of why we're here, right? What I always tell people about the South is rather than see it as an exception, see it as a magnifying mirror, because over and over again we see that the South makes concrete everything that's going on elsewhere that's more abstract, whether it's race, poverty, religion, all this stuff. Look to the South, and then you can extrapolate from that. In terms of standards, I remember my daughter went to a really killer private school in New York and was looking at the the AP practice test for the AP U.S. history test, and I thought, let me weigh in here. I can help you out here. I would have flunked that test, and it was stuff that I actually knew about, like the New Deal, but the questions on there were so specific and truly irrelevant to the understanding of this history that I, an American historian, would have flunked it. Related to that, I always tell my girls that I ended up being a history person, but I took exactly one history course in college, and it was a modern U.S. history course, and frankly, it was just over my head. We were studying things that really interested me, like the Rosenbergs and Alger Hiss and all this stuff, but this was way pre-Google. The teacher was already engaging in the argument about it, and he didn't lay down the primary story. And to do that, I would have had to go read some books, which I didn't have time to do. Now I would Google it. I'd go to Wikipedia, and I'd be right up to speed. But it wasn't until, and so this is sort of, that's how history is taught. Okay, so history, the way I learned history was by going deep bore on one subject, which was the city of Birmingham. And as a result of that, I learned so much about American history because it touched everything. The tentacles and so I would propose that that's the best way of teaching it. The most meaningful way of teaching it is to go deep into a topic, and there's no better topic to get at all of American history than the Civil Rights Movement. But you're not gonna satisfy the standards then. They're not gonna pass the standardized tests.
Can I just say one thing just to conclude this thread? History doesn't teach itself. Okay, so we either have to be willing to engage in a conversation about what we want our kids to know and do, or we can just not afford the luxury of wringing our hands and saying, geez, and it's terrible that the kids don't know this. I wrote down what Mr. Moses said because I think it's something that I really want to think about. Do we need a constitutional right, a constitutional amendment to guarantee a quality public school education? That is a wonderful idea. but follow it to its conclusion. As soon as you do that, you have to define exactly, and I mean exactly, what you mean by a quality education. What is it precisely that you want kids to know? What is it precisely that you want them to be able to do? And how precisely are you going to measure your success? Because that's what we do.
Malcolm X's name has come up several times in here. It's at least worth noting, as a young man, he was an employee here as a waiter and dishwasher. So just wanted to make that note as well. I'm going to ask one more question before I open it up for the audience to ask questions, and this one's for Diane. Your Pulitzer Prize winning work, you really told the story about civil rights and really the revolution in Birmingham. There are some today who say education is the new civil rights. It's really the new civil rights movement. Some veterans of the civil rights movement say that that statement is ahistorical at best or at worst paternalistic. What do you think?
Oh, really? Okay. Paternalistic? Okay, I think that's a little over my head, I'm afraid, like that American history course. I would say that if you look at Birmingham, I don't really know the answer to that. Birmingham now is basically an all-black public school system, and it's failing. And yet, they're surrounded by this history that is still living. There are still people there who demonstrated as children, and the history of the city is not used in the curriculum in any way. And I'm not sure why that's the case. There's a sort of teaching history industry in Birmingham now, where groups come through there to experience firsthand where this great turning point in American history took place. But within the city itself can't somehow harvest that to its own benefit. So I don't know. I'll pass this on to somebody who has more of an idea about it. But something is not working.
Well, I think it's only paternalistic if we just say education, because I think when we think about 21st century, I mean, education, employment, healthcare, but certainly ending mass incarceration and ending criminal injustice in this country is connected to all of that. What you say about Birmingham goes for Little Rock, Arkansas, and many, many other school systems as well. So we know that there's something wrong with our public school systems, and that the more black they became because of white flight, suburbanization, and civil rights, the greater the achievement gap, the greater, in some cases, the resource gap, the greater the unemployment gap. So we know what's happening to public schools in Chicago, but also public schools in places like Roxbury and Dorchester, Mattapan, certain parts here. So I think that's only paternalistic if we don't connect it to a larger, powerful definition and vision of citizenship that connects all these bread and butter issues that Dr. King and others were talking about.
Great segue. Let me offer that the statement is neither historical, ahistorical, paternalistic, but aspirational. And that's okay. Let's not be too harsh on our public school system. I started my remarks by depressing you. Let me conclude by leaving you some hope. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we do at Democracy Prep, the charter school organization that I work for that funds my civic education work in Harlem. We have a particular vision of citizenship there, and it is a very active, engaged citizenship. We stress civic knowledge, skills, dispositions. We do things like take kids to Albany and Washington to lobby their congressmen. We take them to co-location hearings, very controversial in New York City, to testify in public in favor of their schools opening elsewhere. And we take some heat for this, but what I always stress to people is, look, this is their curriculum. So we are demystifying the civic engagement process. We are teaching it as a series of steps and processes, and showing them that your voice matters, and there are skills that people know, buttons that they push, as it were, to make their voice heard and make change happen in the world. And that's our particular view of civic education. Now, would I like that to be undergirded by a more robust understanding of history? Yes. Is it there? No. That's part of the work that I do. But all is not lost. To me, this is the aspirational piece of this, is that we are trying to pay off the aspirations of the civil rights movement and put it in action so the students that we work with in Harlem and soon to be DC and Camden, New Jersey, understand that history is not something that happens to them, but something that they can influence.
Very good. So what I'd like to do, since we have a focus on K-12 education, is to open up the first question to any student, either high school student. We've got one gentleman in the back. Thank you for raising your hand. A microphone will come to you. And you can address your question to one particular panel member, members, or the entire panel.
Hold on one second.
And tell us your name and school.
I'm Cassidy Bates, and I go to Concord Academy, and I'm a senior. And this is just for the whole panel. So there's a saying, I don't know who said it, but that history is written by the victor. Oh, is this better? And this is just proven more by the fact that I've never heard of Diane Nash. I hardly know the story of Malcolm X or really anybody who's not Rosa Parks or King. And I think this is even more depressing because I go to a great school and I have a great teacher. And one thing that we have now is Facebook, which is this tool where we can reach a ton of people, whereas before, you know, we had music where you had to tune in to listen to it, or you could go to a rally, but you actually had to move there yourself. But now we can reach anybody, whether they want it or not, which I think is great. But it's even more sad, as Branch said, because we're actually regressing now. So I guess my question now is, how can we use this as a platform to spread it, and how can we get amped up for this, get some passion behind it, since nobody seems to have that much anymore?
Well, I mean, social media was instrumental in the Arab Spring, so it's already being used, as sort of a civil rights tool. It's just, but in terms of, so it's sort of, civil rights history in action in a certain way. There's, the Berkman Center at the Harvard Law School is developing a lot of the sort of techniques and technology and infrastructure for this. So, yeah, it's happening.
Yeah, I think there's Teaching for Change in DC. There's many different organizations that are trying to do what you're suggesting. And I think, at the national level, PBS just had the series Many Rivers that covered 6 parts, 500 years of African American history. The last 3 really covered civil rights. So there's a way that this story is getting out. I think in popular culture, the movie The Butler, 12 Years a Slave, Mandela have all been important because when if you're trying to reach millions of people, the nuance is very hard to keep, right? So even as brilliant as I think 12 Years a Slave was, I still have criticism in the sense of you don't necessarily see the black church tradition in that movie, and you don't see the spiritual strivings in the slave community. And if you understand the scholarship on slavery, that's a big part of what kept people grounded. And except for one scene where people are singing, and Solomon Northup or Platt starts to sing too, it's missing. And it's incredible to me that you can have a movie about slavery and I don't feel that spiritual, because that's what kept and was embedded in that community just historically. So that nuance is gone, but then it's got plenty of other nuances in it in terms about slavery and capitalism, and all these different things are there. So I think that's happening, but it's important for young people like yourself, and if you have a Twitter account, a social media account, you could start trending and doing some hashtag, civil rights now, to spread that even across Concord Academy. Once you start reading some books about, beyond Rosa Parks, beyond the usual suspects, and sort of share that information.
And I'll provide a teacher response, since your teacher's here, and then a student response. Dr. Ed Ayers is the president of the University of Richmond. Yeah. Prior to assuming that position, he was at the University of Virginia. He created the Digital History Learning Center, where he took a lot of materials, particularly about the Civil War, put it in digital form and made it available worldwide. A number of school districts, not only in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but in other states, are using that material. For you as a student, I had a chance to work on a project at the University of Virginia called The Civil Rights Era and Television. And I had a chance to go to the National Archives, actually find films of King speaking in Danville, Virginia, which no one had seen in about 35 years. We put that into a high school curriculum, in fact, curriculum linked to standards in Virginia, so that students can actually learn and see, wow, King was in Danville, Virginia. Here's what took place. There was a riot that took place also in that area. But it was an interesting way of showing how television played a role in shaping the civil rights movement, because there was a point when we're talking about history where most people didn't own televisions. And when they did, what did that mean, particularly when President Kennedy talked about the moral aspect of the movement and had said it on television and what that meant. For you as a student, I believe in entrepreneurship. Here's an opportunity for you to actually probably create an app or a Twitter or something that Pernell mentioned, and actually create an opportunity for you to educate not only people in Concord, but people in Compton. So, opportunity for you. So a hand. I'll let the person with the microphone be the heavy.
Yeah, I think we'll start.
Okay.
You can start.
One in the back and we'll work our way forward.
Oh, okay. I had a question earlier. It was about
Name?
standardized testing. Oh, my name is Malcolm. Okay, so we all know that standardized testing from, I guess, elementary school to high school, it places students. So my question earlier was, is there still a cultural bias in the standardized testing, especially for like elementary school students? Is it still there, that cultural and class bias? Does it still exist?
Well, I'd say, I'd say yes, it does, but I think the problem is a problem of poverty. Like my students at Youth Build in North Philadelphia, if you ever teach, especially predominantly African American, I had Asian American students who were from Laos as well, and a few white students, but predominantly African American students from poorer, lower social economic backgrounds, and some of the sociological literature shows this too. What you're finding is lacking is, one, a lot of times there was no employment in the household. Two, reading had not been stressed, so the child was behind, and these were high school students just in terms of literacy. Now there were some exceptions. I had some students who were absolutely brilliant. They were coming from challenging circumstances, but they were technically proficient and were facing more emotional, psychological issues of how to make their way, and sort of they had anger issues and things like this. But then I had other students who weren't proficient, meaning that they couldn't necessarily read and comprehend, say, an article in the New York Times, a longish article. They couldn't. And so we were but as a teacher, you don't demonize and say, well, the hell with you. You can't do this, which I think happened to them at other points in their careers. What we did was take everybody where they were at and then did individual collective group projects, but also on an individual level, we assigned sort of micro curriculums for them, where by the end of the quarter and by the end of the semester and then by the end of the year, we wanted that student who might not have been proficient, who might have been on a grading level less than the 12th grade where he was supposed to be or she was supposed to be, that they had actually raised their reading proficiency. It didn't mean that by the end of the year, we got them to the 12th grade proficiency level. What it meant is that we actually made strides, and they were impressed by their own strides, and they were striving for more. That's very different from, say, Concord Academy or Milton Academy, where even though not all those kids have the same level of proficiency, there may be a higher basic level, baseline, common denominator of proficiency, and then instructors may have a more ambitious agenda. So yes, I think there is cultural bias, but I think it's the testing, but the biggest problem with our educational system, and this goes from my time at Youth Build in Philadelphia, but also from growing up in New York City, is that it's a question of poverty in these school districts. And this is poverty that is endemic and entrenched and is generational. And so we see it in Boston, we see it in New Orleans. There's parts of the country, Mississippi Delta, I've visited the Delta, I've visited Lowndes County, Alabama. You go to the parts of places that are still very similar in terms of lack of infrastructure and resources to 50 years ago and 70 years ago and 100 years ago. But no one wants to say anything. I mean, promise zones by the president are not enough, right? Promise zones in 5 cities are not going to solve this. So yes, there's a cultural bias, but the biggest problem here is one of poverty. It's one of poverty and resources in these very specific schools where if you went to some of these school children's, and I went to my students' homes. I went to their homes, and people were living in some of the worst projects that I've ever seen in North Philadelphia along Girard Avenue, all right? Some of this stuff looked like burnt out homes outside of the United States. And this is where people were living, right? And then you're expecting this 16 and 17 and 18-year-old to digest the New York Times and to really get into Malcolm X's autobiography. And if you see what he or she has to live with, you'd say, well, yes, I see why it's challenging for you to do the assignments that I've given you over the weeks. So this is a question of poverty.
Yes, poverty matters. Very quick answer, because we could spend 2 hours talking about this. It gets technical. Standardized tests do not always measure what we think they measure. They tend to be de facto tests of background knowledge. Poverty affects language, it affects background knowledge. So yes, they are biased, but not always in the obvious ways, but they are sometimes more subtle and in that way perhaps more pernicious. But again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, until or unless we are more clear about what precisely we want our students to know and test them based on that, we will always have this problem. This is a problem that transcends our discussion today. I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards.
Just very quickly, one example of the biases that we're talking about it, Jameis Winston, the African-American quarterback of FSU, they just won the national championship. When he was being interviewed on television, A.J. McCarron, the quarterback of Alabama, his mother tweeted, "Am I hearing English?" That's the United States of America that we live in. Because Jameis Winston has an accent. He's Southern, he's black. She tweeted out that he wasn't speaking English, right? And this is in 2014, right after the national championship. That's how people feel about black people in the United States in 2014. I love the tweet. I disagreed with the tweet. I criticized her on Twitter. But I love the tweet because it's unfettered racism. It's unfettered white supremacy. It's saying that this young black man who just won a national championship is not speaking the king's or queen's English, and you're going to call him out on it, right? So no matter how many millions he might make in the NFL, no matter what he achieves, you're saying, "Am I hearing English?" And then, of course, she tweets that her and her family are far from being racist, right? That's the country we all live in.
Got it. Another hand?
Hi, my name is Rich Young. I'm a project director at a Teaching American History grant in Dedham at the Education Cooperative. And I wanted to address just briefly, if you bear with me, the standards issue, because I think that when I was a coordinator in Brookline, we had yet another Martin Luther King Assembly Day, and it was one of those things where the 6th grade was having to present at that assembly. And the teachers and I decided, rather than the usual, I loved your phrase about, Rosa sat so that Martin could walk and Obama could fly. Rather than do that, what we did was we assigned each kid of 60-some kids a different person in the African-American history. So one kid was Frederick Douglass, and another one was Martin Luther King, another one was Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, and so on, right down the line. I mean, you got to find 60-some people. And each kid had to do research on each of those people, so that part of the standards movement was, part of the standards we addressed was research, another one was writing. They had to write something up, and then they had to perform it within their class for each other, but also at the school assembly. We picked the best of those performances, and the kids dressed up as their person, they spoke as their person, and it was really a remarkable thing. And I think there are lots of ways of getting in a quick fashion. I heard from over here that they didn't know a lot about a lot of different people in African-American history and in the movement and so on. And I think that's just one quick way of doing that, okay? So, I'd be happy to talk some more to somebody about how that was done and how it can be done. The other thing, I had a question, and that was about the sanitizing and the scrubbing of MLK, I'm just wondering, from all of the panel, if he had not been murdered in 1968, what do you think would have been the arc of the rest of his life?
We're looking at you, Diane.
Really?
Where's Taylor Branch when you need him?
Yeah, Taylor?
Taylor went to the bathroom.
Taylor, went to the bathroom?
I'll start. I'll say that Dr. King was a social political revolutionary. What we were seeing, he was talking about radical revolutionary human rights. He was talking about a revolution of values. He talked about triple threats to humanity of materialism, militarism, racism. He never would have tried to actively, I don't think, run for president of the United States in that way. People tried to convince him that. I think if you look at the late 60s, early 70s, he would have become a coalition leader for not just African Americans and people of color, but for whites who are interested in social justice as well. And certainly I think that the interesting part when we look at the history of the 1970s, and there's a great book by Jefferson Cowie on the history of the 70s called Staying Alive, is that the first half of the 1970s is an uproariously radical time of protest in places like Youngstown, Ohio, of protest by coal miners, of African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans on reservations. This is an extraordinary revolutionary time. So the 60s don't end on December 31st, 1969. And so when we think about King, had King lived, he would have really been at a central focal point of all these different movements for social and economic justice that transcended race, that were for a global peace movement, and that I think he would have provided much more moral force and legitimacy to these movements. You know, so when we think about had he lived, I think he would have been extraordinarily, prescient in terms of the coalition of the powerless that he was trying to organize while he was living in a great way that comes together to fruition, in the aftermath of his death. But the kind of moral force to lead that coalition, it becomes much more disparate. So it's all around, but people aren't looking at one person who they sort of, and I'll say who they trust enough to lead it. So there's many different leaders, but I think that King would have had the trust of these different groups to be that representative, because he realized that's what he was, sort of a conduit and a representative.
Okay, Taylor's back. I think he's answered this question many times. What would King have, if he had lived out a normal lifespan? How would he have evolved or? Oh, come on, Taylor, just play the tape.
I always say that I could never channel him, but I'm always asked to channel him, and that's really, really unfair. But I do think that for me, studying his life for so long, if I had to boil it down into one thing, it's the things you take for granted that are dangerous. But it's learning about the things you take for granted that are the aha moments that are the real beginning of education. And for me, the way I would say it is very briefly here, he was always sending off light bulbs about the picture being larger. We're assuming here today that the phrase civil rights, we're all using the phrase civil rights. Most kids today do not think civil rights is about them, black and white. White kids think it's about black kids. Black kids think it's about a quaint time when you had to sit in the back of the bus. Therefore, civil rights is not about anybody. But the truth is that we learn the history of the black freedom struggle because that is the key to what civil rights really is, literally, meaning rights pertaining to citizenship. So that it's not about our past, it's about our future. So that if I had to do an academic standard, I would want kids by the time they got out of high school to give a good answer to the question, Why is our civil rights critical for you and your future? Not about the quaint past. And I think that's what King did consistently, was to set off light bulbs that this struggle, it may have started about buses and colored water fountains and everything, but it opened not only light bulbs on the past and what it's really about, including the harshest ones you're talking about, but it equips us for the future, everybody, so that it's about everybody. And in that sense, I don't know exactly what he would have done. His movement, really, in my view, is more appreciated outside the United States than inside the United States, which is a sad statement on our country.
Well, picking up on what Taylor said, one thing I always tell when I talk to kids is that, the way this history is taught is that this country went through this, period of mass social insanity, and then we all came to our senses. But what I, want to impress upon them is that the scariest thing about segregation is that it felt normal. It was normal to people who lived under it, white and black. And the few black revolutionaries who refused to accept it as normal changed this history. And it was not a majority. It was not close to a majority to begin with. So, what I say to my own daughters is these were normal, the white people were normal people behaving this way. They were good people, went to church, prominent in their communities, and they behaved this way. So that is how you need to approach this history, I think, and I always challenge kids now to say, what do we accept now that we may look back on in 30 years as a form of mass social insanity? And I have a lot of ideas. I think diagnosing and dosing children with medication is one of those. But and the standards, the whole standards mania is part of this entire mindset of like turning people back into objects in certain ways, which is what the civil rights movement is all about. And yet now we seem to be embracing that in a certain way. Everybody's going along with the program. Most people went along with the program of segregation too. So that's another way in which this is relevant. That what are we able to accept as normal, and what does it take, as Taylor said, for somebody like Martin Luther King to make us see it as something that should be challenged and overturned.
Well, like with any great conversation, we've reached our conclusion. Some of you, I know, have questions. Some of our panelists will remain here. Again, I want to thank the Pioneer Institute for starting this dialogue. I want to thank Robert for his work at Democracy Prep and for your work, in particular on standards, keeping that at the forefront of conversation of public policy. I want to thank Peniel for his work on Black Power and its role in civil rights. Since you mentioned Haiti, Toussaint L'Ouverture, through my grandfather's lineage, supposedly we have a link to him. Oh, nice. I want to thank Bill for his work, making sure through an encyclopedia form that gospel music is a part of world conversation. And I want to thank Diane for her history book, particularly a story about a very important city in America and what that meant for human rights across the world. And with that, I will turn it over to Jim.
I just want to extend our thanks to the panel. Thank you very much. Great conversation. Thank you again, Bob. Thank you, Taylor, for being here today. Thank all of you. I just want to highlight two very quick things. There are books in the back. There will be a book signing if you want to pick up some books. The authors would love to sign those. And the second thing just to note is on the 23rd, next week, we're holding a film screening of The Ticket, which takes viewers on a sort of a historic whistle-stop train tour across the country looking at different school choice programs. It'll be held at 6:15 on the 23rd of January. It's free. It'll be held at the AMC Boston Common Theaters, 175 Tremont Street, right down the street. We'd love to see you there. Thank you very much.